Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast, supported by Museum Development North and Arts Council England.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for this latest episode of the podcast. Today, we're starting the first of 4 conversations which take us into the world of aircraft design. Our guide is going to be Les Willans, who joined British Aerospace in 1979 in his late 20s. He came having served his technician apprentice training at Ferranti Limited. He subsequently worked for Ferranti and for Simon Container Machinery Limited for 8 years before moving into the aircraft industry. We're going to hear about his design and engineering work on Hawker Siddeley and British Aerospace aircraft such as the Nimrod, the HS-146, the Advanced Turboprop and the Avro RJ or Regional Jet. Les came to British Aerospace with quite a lot of experience under his belt. He soon realised, though, working in aircraft design was a very different environment from what he'd been used to. He coped well with the transition, but you will hear how some people making that same move found it harder. And you may be surprised to learn that one of Les's first projects was to do with fitting a parachute, but to a commercial passenger airliner. And listen out too for a design decision on the nose of the ATP, which involved a rather unconventional approach. To start us off, I asked Les what had first led him down this 31-year career path in aviation design and engineering at Woodford, Chadderton and many other company sites.
Got to a point where, like most young men, boys, get to the end of their school life, it's what happens next. And I hadn't really any idea what I wanted to do after, I was going to leave school. But first off, we got year O levels. I wasn't very studious and I didn't pass the requisite O levels that I should have done. I only got the fairly easy ones like engineering and technical drawing. O level was one of them, and English I think was the other, and woodwork. So then my dad said, "Well, you never get a job with that, so I'll send you to college." So I went to Stockport College to do some more O levels, and I got the rest of the O levels that I would needed to get a job. So you really needed 5 O levels, pass O levels. So I did that, and I found it easier to do that time because I was with more mature students. Then the point was, well, what are you going to do now? So in between that and getting an apprenticeship, which is what my dad suggested, said you need to apply for jobs because the thing you're good at, if you say you're good at, is drawing, and drawing means you go to a company that would, and so it was more to do with the local companies in Stockport. One was Merleys. I went to Ferranti's first, I think. They were looking for apprenticeships. You were given very basic tests. One of which was, which way does the gear wheel go if you turn this other gear wheel, things like that. And then there was a practical test which involved bending a piece of wire to the shape of on the drawing. All you had is a piece of wire, a picture and a pair of pliers. It started off with a triangle, then it was twisted, then it was an offset square, and then it joined at the bottom. And people started with one end around the drawing, tried to get it all to meet in the beginning instead of starting in the middle and working way to the bottom, which I did. And people kept looking at me to see what I'd done. So somewhere along the line, I twigged that my mind worked differently to other people. Sometime later, there must have been a letter arrived and said, yes, we're pleased to offer you an apprenticeship at Apprentice.
In those days, what was the competition like? Would there have been lots of people there?
There were, because I remember there must have been a room full of people taking this same test. So it was a written and a practical test. So there must have been about 30 or 40 people.
Did this guarantee you a job at the end of it?
No. You went through a government-prepared syllabus, if you like, for an apprentice training, which was, I think, 12 months for your first year. So you had to do a certain amount of things in apprentice training school. So you did practical skills tests. So you had a set of drawings, objects that you had to make. which was, he had filing and cutting with steel, and then he went on to using machines, and then he went on to forge, was making things with putting metal into a hot fire, beating it with a hammer. Then he went on to electrical bit, doing soldering with a big heavy copper-based soldering iron, and then he did wiring up a simple plug and open wiring circuit of a plug and lights and switches. He then graduated to do further training by virtue of going to college. I ended up into the drawing office, and that's where basically I stayed effectively from that point in time in 1969, 70, somewhere about that period. I just went in the drawing office for a short period of time, and the chief draftsman had a conversation with me and asked me what qualifications I was going through, and I told him, and then he said, how would you like a job in the drawing office? 4 or 5 years. Takes us to about 1979. I got married in between in that period of time, in 1978. So I was looking for more money because I was a married man. I needed to pay a mortgage with a wife, and myself needed to find extra money. So I thought a friend of mine who moved jobs, that does jobs here. So back then you could just ring up the HR department and say, are the jobs going? And they send you an application form for a job. So that's what I did.
And so we're now 1979. We're now British Aerospace.
British Aerospace, yeah.
So you moved from quite a different world.
Yes.
From
normal engineering, yeah,
into aviation industry. So what was that transition like?
Well, the first thing people do with the new starters is give you the handbook to read, and there's nothing more boring than reading through a handbook, which is one of my bugbears for the rest of my life. But, so they give these things to keep you occupied while they found you a job to do. And when I started on this job, I thought, well, I'll just carry on doing this. I'd give me a little thing to draw a little bracket, drew it, and somebody said to me, oh, you can't do that. And I said, well, why? Well, there are guidelines to how you can put holes in pieces of metal. I said, oh, okay, what are they? And so they showed me the page in the handbook, which simply means that because of the way the airplanes are built and organised, and I'd never come across a stress department before, we didn't have those things. I said, well, this is, undertakes a certain load on the part of a component, and so there is a distance from the centre of the hole to the edge of the material that is governed by the diameter of the hole that you use, and it's usually 2.5 times the diameter of the hole that you use. It gives you what they call an edge distance. So then there's other things like there's design standards, there are regulations that have to be borne in mind by the government and industry, which are BCAR's British Civil Aviation rules, which govern how airplanes are manufactured. There are rules for each of the parts of the airplane, like size of the doors, weights of things like doors out for over-wing exit. So got to be managed by a person, like a passenger. It can't be above a certain weight. So all of those things all have to be taken into consideration. And all this to me was like completely alien to begin with. But as the years progress and you go through your life in work, you begin to learn all these things, and it becomes almost second knowledge.
And just so we're clear, you're an engineer, so you're working to somebody's design, is that right? Have you got a drawing which you have to work from?
Sometimes you are given a vague idea of what the requirement is.
So and really, in that situation, you're doing more of the designing yourself.
Yes, but the very first job was to do with the HS-146, which was starting production again. It's the Hatfields project, which is where the HS is the Hawker Siddeley. Originally, it was a de Havilland project. De Havilland got taken over by Armstrong Siddeley's, and then Hawker Siddeley, then merged in 1977 and became British Aerospace. And then so all these sites became one company, and so the names followed along. So the name changed from de Havilland to HS Hawker Siddeley, and there was a requirement on the first test flight, because it had never flown before, because of the design of the aircraft has a high tail and a high wing. They weren't sure that if they undertook what's called a flat spin, that they could lose control of the aircraft and they wouldn't be able to recover, because the tailplane is being masked by the wings. And that was a sort of overall understanding of what we were supposed to design. And somebody had thought of, other than me, and 2 other people, I think, were working on the project. They were given an outline proposal by a senior engineer. So you effectively have design and draftsmen, and then you have engineering staff who look at the practical things like systems and functions of other pieces of the aircraft. And so they decided that they wanted to put something called an anti-spin parachute system on the back of the airplane in place of the air brake system. So the air brakes had to come off. We had to fit it in that location. And what it meant was they had to design a mechanism to release a parachute. So you had to find a space to put a parachute in. You had to find a mechanism that would help keep the parachute attached to the airframe, and then some structure that attached to the airframe itself. And that's a vague outline of what you would do. Then you would think of all the ideas as you went along, and that's to get them. But ultimately, it was never used. Had it designed and manufactured.
And at this era, because it was 1979-80, what about IT? Is computer assisted design? Is that coming?
That came later. That came in. I'm just trying to think now. Somewhere about the mid 1980s. I mean, it first started off with a very basic computer system, which was a green screen, and where it used to refresh, and it basically was like an old television, and if it every time you used a function, the screen used to refresh, and it got greener and greener on the background, so it burned away the cathode ray tube almost. And it like a submarine substation originally on a base. So it was the screen and the base were all combined, and then the screens became separate screens and a separate computing system like we recognise today. We had a base unit and TV screen, and it was black and white, and that became the very first sort of CAD system.
And then alongside the Ultra 6, in this period, you were doing some work on Nimrod, is that?
Yeah, basically we're doing design changes, if you like, for manufacturing errors. I do remember just seeing a designer taking me. He said, "Come on, we're going on the shop floor. We've got an issue with one of the tailplane fairings that there seems to be a mistake. We don't know what it is, but we've been told that there's a problem we need to look at." So we duly went along there, and the fitter was told they put the anchor nut hole in the wrong place on the aircraft, and so he needed to take the anchor nut off. Basically, an anchor nut is a fixed nut that's riveted to the airplane with two little 3/32 diameter rivets. He was told to just take the thing off the aircraft. We got there, he actually chain drilled round the anchor nut and left a great big hole where the anchor nut should have been, which meant a repair to the aircraft to put a new piece of skin panel in. And so I thought that was quite funny that he'd taken the job literally. We think he was one of these employees that come from another company, a different type of engineering company. He didn't know the terminology about how to do this job. Those are sort of things that, stupid things like that happened. There was a new project on the horizon. We understood. Nobody told us much about it, and we were moved offices. We were taken from what was called drawing office number 1, which was on the top floor of the main office block at the front of the factory, and we were transferred over to another office block, which was called E block, which was facing the airfield. So we were located over there, and we were given simple tasks to do, which was called service bulletins, which were incorporating modifications to existing aircraft. And you write out a technical description how to do the job. So effectively you utilise information from Illustrated Parts Catalogue, which is a great big thick book, and you find in there where the components are, and then you describe how you turn off the battery, how you get your parts, how you dismantle things. You write all this out, and that's put together in a document, and then it's sent to the airlines, and they're supposed to carry out that task. And they're classified as minor and major and mandatory. And it's a mandatory modification, and the airline has to carry it out within a certain amount of time, because the Civil Aviation Authority rules dictate what these things do. And then we were told that this new aeroplane design was coming along, which was a variation on the HS748, which is going, well, originally they called it an ATP, which was just a variation on a longer version of the 748, and turboprop really was the variation on the aircraft. So we started off effectively sketching out what needed to be done. We recognised that because it was going to be longer, the stringers that run longitudinally down the airframe had to be in different pieces, and we had to do an outline of how the skeleton of the airplane would have looked. So you've got a front section, which is the nose, then you've got a middle tube, then you had the centre section of the airplane. Somebody had to decide how that centre section was going to be manufactured, and whether we could use an existing centre section from another aircraft, which was the 780 aircraft, which is a militarised version of the 748, which has had a ramp at the back of the aircraft, and that had a bigger wing centre section in the middle. So it had a sort of stub wing, and because it had a bigger propeller on it, so the engines are further apart. So they realised that if we needed a big propeller, we needed a different centre section. So that was a separate item altogether. And then the tail was another bit. So there were two new things that were put onto the aircraft. The tailplane angle was sort of fairly square on the 748, and the nose on the front 748 was quite bulbous. And the chief designer at the time thought it needed to look more modern, like a more modern airplane, so the tail needed to sweep back a certain amount to make it look as though it was flying faster. And so go faster, like having the go faster stripe, yeah. And so he had just 3 different angles. He put 5 degrees, 10 degrees, and 15-degree rake on the tailplane, and then he decided which one looked the nicest. There's no other reason that it was proposed. And the other bit was how sharp the nose was on the radome, if you like. And one day apparently he went out with his wife and he sketched the shape of this nose cone on a piece of napkin, and he did sort of 3 iterations on this napkin. And he said to his wife, "Which one of these do you like?" And she picked one, and that's what we got. And he sounds really quite incredulous.
So in those first 6 years on the ATP, Les, which I think you returned to it a bit later, I think you got quite a few promotions.
Yeah. Part of it is probably based on the length of your career. Part of it is on how you're seen by your supervisor, and he would probably recommend you for that regrade. And sometimes it's all around. It was all to do with union pay rises and things, So it varied sometimes. It was sometimes, in some cases, the union seemed to want to fudge how you got a pay rise because you were limited by the government on how much you could get as a pay rise. So they limited companies to maybe 3 or 4% as a pay rise. And one way around it was to have a new grading system. And then ultimately, my very last promotion was going from a sort of senior designer. We had a point where what was called a section leader or a group leader, looking after a section of people in the office, retired, and we were left without somebody to look after us. And I was just the most senior by grade in the group. People kept asking me, "When are we going to get a new boss?" I don't know. This went on for quite a few weeks. Till in the end, I got fed up with them asking me. So I marched off and I knocked on the boss's door. I said, "Can I have a word?" He said, "What do you want?" I said, "Well, the guys on the group there, and me included, said, we want to know when we're getting a new group leader." And he just shrugged his shoulders. I said, "Don't know." "What do you mean?" I said, "What do you mean you don't know?" So, "Well, I don't know. We've not thought about it." So, what does it take to get a person in that situation? Does it take for me to ask for this job? He said, "Well, if you're going to ask, yes." And that's how I got promoted. He actually had me in mind, but he didn't want to tell me. He was waiting to see how long it took me to go in the office to ask for the job. That followed along by a bit of stress in the end, really, because I was never very confident in my own ability back then. And I asked my dad, I said, I'm getting a bit stressed at work. I don't quite know how to proceed in a supervisory role. He said, "Yeah, you've got to separate yourself from being their friend to being their boss. And it can be quite a difficult changeover." He said, "But just think about how you manage them by making them think that they've thought of the answer to the question and not them. You telling them what it is. So you have to give them leading questions and ask in a way that they think they've made the decision for themselves." And so I thought, "Oh, that sounds like a good idea. I'm sure I can do that quite well." And I seemed to get the gist of it after a while.
Thank you to Les for the first part of that conversation. In the next episode, Les moves to a different aircraft to work on the design of the fixed leading edge structure between its inboard and outboard engines. And it's an aircraft that you may well not associate with the Avro Heritage story. To find out which aircraft, join me for that episode. In the meantime, thank you for listening, and it's goodbye from me, Chris Beswick.
Make sure you follow us in your podcast app to ensure that you don't miss out on future episodes.